March 15, 1945. The transport truck rattled down a dusty Texas road, carrying cargo that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. 32 German women prisoners of war, heading toward a makeshift detention facility outside San Antonio. Through the canvas covering, 22-year-old Greta Hoffmann caught glimpses of a landscape so vast and empty it made her stomach tighten with unfamiliar anxiety. This wasn't the rolling green hills of Bavaria, she remembered. This was something else entirely, something that felt like the edge of the world itself. The women sat in rigid silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained with the long journey across the Atlantic. They had been captured in Belgium during the final chaotic months of the war, serving as communications operators and administrative personnel for retreating Wehrmacht forces. Now they found themselves in the heart of enemy territory, thousands of miles from anything familiar. Greta clutched a small photograph of her family's farm near Munich, the only possession she had managed to keep through the chaos of capture and transportation. Her younger sister smiled up at her from the faded image, frozen in a moment that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas was pulled back, the blast of Texas heat hit them like opening an oven door. March in Bavaria meant lingering winter chill and the first hesitant signs of spring. March in Texas meant temperatures already climbing toward 80 degrees, sun so bright it hurt to look at the pale sky, and air so dry it seemed to steal moisture from their lungs with every breath. The women stumbled down from the truck bed, squinting against the unfamiliar sun, their European skin already beginning to burn in the relentless southwestern light. The facility itself looked nothing like the prison camps they had imagined. Instead of imposing concrete structures, they saw a collection of low wooden buildings arranged around a dusty central yard. Chain-link fencing marked the perimeter, but beyond it stretched endless miles of scrubland dotted with mesquite trees and prickly pear cactus. The horizon seemed impossibly distant, as if the earth went on forever without the comforting boundaries of mountains or forests to contain it. Several of the women exchanged nervous glances, wondering if this emptiness was itself a form of psychological warfare, designed to make them feel small and lost and utterly insignificant. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee the facility, watched the German women disembark with a mixture of professional assessment and unexpected sympathy. She had expected hardened Nazi operatives, women whose faces would reflect the ideology that had plunged the world into war. Instead, she saw exhausted young women who looked barely older than her own nieces back in Houston, their eyes reflecting confusion and fear more than defiance. They moved with careful military bearing, trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that stripped away almost everything else, but their body language betrayed their profound disorientation in this strange new environment. Among the American guards assembled to receive the prisoners stood James Tucker, though everyone called him Red for the shock of auburn hair that escaped from beneath his service cap. At 24 years old, Red represented everything distinctly Texan about the facility's staff. He had grown up on a cattle ranch outside Fredericksburg, learning to ride before he could properly walk, and he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had always known exactly who he was and where he belonged. The war had pulled him into military service, but it hadn't fundamentally changed his easygoing nature or his habit of treating everyone he met with the same casual friendliness he would show a neighbor at a county dance. Red watched the German women line up for processing with genuine curiosity rather than hostility. He had fought in North Africa and seen enough of war to know that most soldiers on both sides were just ordinary people caught up in something bigger than themselves. These women looked scared and hot and completely out of their element, and his instinct was the same as it would be for anyone in distress to help make things a little easier if he could. The processing took most of the afternoon, with each woman being assigned a bunk number, issued basic supplies, and photographed for camp records. Greta found herself struggling with the paperwork, not because her English was poor, she had studied it in school, but because the Texas accents of the staff members made every word sound like it was being pulled through honey, slow and sweet and utterly incomprehensible. When the clerk asked her something she couldn't understand, she simply nodded, hoping it was the appropriate response, while feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her inability to communicate. By late afternoon, the women were being shown to their barracks, each carrying an armload of blankets, toiletries, and basic necessities. Greta struggled with her bundle, the unfamiliar weight awkwardly distributed in her tired arms. She had been traveling for 3 days with minimal sleep, and the Texas heat had sapped what little energy she had left. As she approached the wooden steps leading into the barracks, one of the thin towels slipped from her grasp and fell into the dust. Before she could bend to retrieve it, Red Tucker was there, scooping up the towel and beating the dust off it against his leg. He looked at her with an easy smile that seemed completely at odds with their roles as captor and captive, as enemy and prisoner. "Here you go, Darlin," he said, holding out the towel. "Watch your step on those stairs now. They get slippery when the dust builds up." Greta froze completely, her arms still full of supplies, staring at this American soldier who had just called her something she couldn't quite believe she had heard correctly. Darlin. The English word was close enough to the German labeling that its meaning was unmistakable, but the context made absolutely no sense. This was an enemy soldier, a guard at a prison camp, addressing her with a term of endearment as casually as if they were acquaintances at a social gathering. Her mind raced through possible explanations. Was this some kind of cruel mockery, a prelude to harassment, a psychological tactic designed to confuse and unsettle them? Her confusion must have shown on her face, because Red's smile faltered slightly. "Ma'am," he said, still holding out the towel. "You all right? The heat getting to you? We got water inside if you need it." Greta took the towel with trembling fingers, managing a stiff nod before hurrying up the stairs into the barracks. Behind her, she heard Red calling out to another prisoner, with the same casual friendliness, his tone suggesting he hadn't noticed anything unusual about the interaction at all. Inside the dim barracks, the German women gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed German as they claimed bunks and tried to process everything about this bewildering new reality. Greta found her assigned bunk and sat down heavily, still clutching the towel that had been returned to her with such inexplicable kindness. Anna Richter, a 26-year-old former radio operator from Hamburg, sat on the adjacent bunk, her sharp eyes studying Greta's troubled expression. "What happened out there?" Anna asked in German. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Greta struggled to find words to describe what had just occurred. "He called me Darlin," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The American guard. He helped me with my things and called me Darlin, like I was his sweetheart or his sister or someone he actually cared about." Several nearby women stopped their unpacking to listen. Maria Schneider, at 31, the oldest among them, and a former administrative supervisor, frowned deeply. "It's a trap," she said with conviction. "They're trying to make us lower our guard, to make us trust them so they can gather information or manipulate us. We must be careful. Remember, these are still our enemies, no matter how friendly they pretend to be." But another voice offered a different interpretation. Liesel Wagner, barely 19 and the youngest of their group, spoke up hesitantly. "Maybe that's just how Americans are? My cousin immigrated to New York before the war, and she wrote that Americans were very informal, that they treated strangers like friends. Maybe it doesn't mean anything special at all?" This possibility seemed almost more disturbing than the idea of deliberate manipulation. The notion that an enemy soldier would show casual kindness to a prisoner simply because that was his nature challenged everything they had been taught about Americans during the war. The first days at the Texas facility established a pattern that left the German women in a constant state of confused vigilance. Every interaction with the American staff seemed designed to contradict their expectations in ways both large and small. Guard Sergeant William Chen, whose parents had emigrated from Guangzhou decades earlier, made a point of greeting each prisoner by name during morning roll call, pronouncing the German names with careful effort that showed genuine respect rather than mockery. Corporal Thomas Hayes from Mississippi brought his harmonica to the evening guard shift and played soft melodies that drifted through the camp, music that seemed to have no purpose except to make the endless Texas nights feel less empty and strange. Greta found herself analyzing every gesture, every word, searching for hidden motives. When Red Tucker held the door open for her while she carried laundry baskets, was he being condescending? When Lieutenant Morrison asked about her previous work experience with genuine interest, was she gathering intelligence or simply making conversation? The uncertainty was exhausting, requiring constant mental effort to decode interactions that the Americans seemed to conduct with thoughtless ease. The language barrier amplified every misunderstanding. The Texas drawl transformed simple English into an impenetrable code. When the cook, an older woman named Betty Martinez, asked Greta if she wanted her eggs over easy or sunny side up, Greta stared blankly, understanding each individual word, but unable to grasp what they meant in combination. Betty simply smiled, made both kinds, and let Greta choose, treating the confusion as a normal part of communication rather than a source of frustration or ridicule. It was the small, practical kindnesses that proved most disorienting. When Anna developed a severe sunburn after working outdoors without understanding the danger of Texas sun, Red appeared with aloe vera gel from his own personal supplies. "Here," he said, handing her the tube. "My mama swears by this stuff. You'll want to stay in the shade tomorrow, though. This sun don't mess around." Anna accepted the gel with suspicion, certain there must be some catch, some expectation of reciprocity or submission. But Red simply tipped his hat and walked away, asking nothing in return. That evening, when the aloe actually worked, soothing her burned skin and reducing the angry redness, Anna felt something shift inside her understanding of their situation. Maria Schneider maintained that everything was calculated strategy. "They're softening us up," she insisted to the other women, "making us grateful, making us compliant. When they eventually demand something from us, we'll feel obligated to give it because of all these little kindnesses." But even Maria's certainty began to waver when Sergeant Chen spent his lunch break teaching Liesel how to write a letter to the Red Cross to locate her family. He used his own paper, his own time, and asked for nothing except the chance to practice his limited German with her. His patience seemed limitless, his desire to help apparently genuine. April brought the first Red Cross letters from Germany, and with them, the beginning of a different kind of devastation. The women gathered in the barracks common room as Lieutenant Morrison distributed the thin envelopes that had traveled thousands of miles to reach them. Not everyone received mail. Of the 32 women in the facility, only 14 had letters waiting. The others watched with hollow eyes as their companions opened connections to a homeland that seemed to have forgotten they existed. Greta's hands shook as she recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope. She had not heard from her family since her capture in Belgium 7 months earlier. The uncertainty had been its own special torture, not knowing whether her parents and sister still lived, whether their farm still stood, whether the life she remembered even existed anymore. She carried the letter to her bunk and sat with it unopened for nearly an hour, afraid of what truth might be contained in those folded pages. When she finally opened it, the words swam before her eyes. Her mother's handwriting, usually so precise and elegant, wobbled across the page as if written by someone whose hand could barely hold the pen steady. The letter was dated February 10, 1945, which meant it had taken 2 months to reach Texas. Her mother wrote of Allied bombing raids that had devastated Munich, of their farm somehow surviving while the city around it burned. Her father had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the last desperate militia of old men and boys defending Germany's collapsing borders. They had heard nothing from him in 3 weeks. The most devastating paragraph came near the end. "Your sister Karen joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel Youth Service last year," her mother wrote. "She was sent to Berlin to help with war production. We received word in January that the factory where she worked was destroyed in a bombing raid. They found her identification papers in the rubble, but not her body. We do not know if she escaped or if she is among the uncounted dead. We hope, but hope costs so much energy that we have little left for anything else." Greta read these words 3 times, before their meaning fully penetrated her consciousness. Her baby sister, who had been 15 years old when Greta last saw her, who had loved flowers and music and silly romantic novels, might be dead. Or might be alive somewhere in the chaos of collapsing Germany, with no way to contact her family, no way to let them know she had survived. The uncertainty felt worse than confirmed death, a wound that could never properly heal because it never properly closed. Around the barracks, similar scenes of grief played out in quiet German murmurs. Anna received news that her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had been destroyed in firestorm bombings, her family's whereabouts unknown. Liesel learned that her father had died of pneumonia during the brutal winter, unable to get proper medical care in a country where hospitals were overwhelmed and medicine was scarce. Maria discovered that her husband, a Wehrmacht officer, was missing in action on the Eastern Front, almost certainly dead or captured by Soviet forces. The personal grief of lost families and destroyed homes created a somber atmosphere throughout the camp, but the American staff responded with unexpected sensitivity. Red brought Greta a cup of coffee the morning after she received her letter, saying nothing, just setting it down beside her with a gentle nod that acknowledged her pain without demanding she explain it. Lieutenant Morrison allowed the women extra time for writing letters, understanding that maintaining connection with whatever remained of their homeland had become a psychological necessity. But it was the arrival of American newspapers in late April that transformed their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the war. Sergeant Chen had been bringing newspapers to the camp for weeks, partly to help the women improve their English, partly because he believed they deserved to understand the world events that had shaped their captivity. Most days, the women struggled through articles about political developments and military movements, their limited English making the reading tedious and often confusing. Then came the photographs from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau, from Buchenwald. The images were grainy, but unmistakable. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors who looked more like animated corpses than living human beings. Mass graves being excavated by Allied soldiers who wore expressions of horror that transcended any language barrier. The accompanying articles described systematic murder on a scale that seemed impossible, industrial processes designed for the efficient killing of millions of human beings. Greta sat in the barracks common room, the newspaper spread before her on a wooden table, staring at photographs that her mind struggled to accept as real. This was Germany. Her Germany. The country of Goethe and Beethoven, of Christmas markets and mountain villages, of orderly streets and proud traditions. How could the same nation that produced such beauty have also produced this industrialized nightmare? Anna found her there, drawn by the sound of Greta's sharp intake of breath. She looked over Greta's shoulder at the newspaper and went completely still. "That can't be real," she whispered in German. "That's propaganda. The Allies are trying to make us look like monsters to justify what they've done to our cities." But more newspapers arrived over the following days, from different sources, with different perspectives, all telling the same horrifying story. British papers, American papers, even Swedish neutral sources reported the same evidence. Testimonies from survivors described years of systematic abuse, starvation, medical experiments, and mass murder. The numbers were incomprehensible. Millions, not thousands, not tens of thousands, but millions of people deliberately killed in camps that had operated throughout the war, while ordinary Germans claimed they knew nothing. The women gathered around these newspapers like people examining evidence of their own crimes, searching desperately for some explanation that would allow them to maintain their understanding of who they were and what they had served. Maria, who had been so certain about American manipulation, sat with tears streaming down her face as she read accounts from liberated camps. "I didn't know," she kept repeating in German. "We didn't know. How could we not have known?" Liesel threw up after seeing the photographs, her young mind unable to process the reality of such systematic cruelty. Greta held her hair back and wondered how the girl would ever recover from learning that her youthful patriotism had been in service to something so monstrous. The revelation about the concentration camps created a psychological crisis that the American staff had not anticipated and did not know how to address. Lieutenant Morrison found herself ill-equipped to counsel women who were grappling with the collapse of their entire moral framework. She had been trained to manage prisoners of war, not to guide people through existential devastation about their own identities. But she recognized that leaving the women to drown in their guilt and confusion would be cruel and counterproductive, so she made a decision that raised eyebrows among her superiors. She would allow, even encourage, increased interaction between the German prisoners and American staff, believing that human connection might provide what formal counseling could not. Red Tucker understood the assignment without needing explicit instructions. He had watched Greta retreat into herself after the newspaper articles arrived, her face taking on the haunted expression of someone who no longer knew who she was supposed to be. One warm evening in early May, he found her sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at the Texas sunset with empty eyes. The sky was performing its evening spectacle, bands of orange and pink and purple stretching across the horizon in a display that never failed to move him, even after seeing it thousands of times. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, already settling himself on the ground beside her bench, not waiting for permission, because he sensed that asking might give her an excuse to refuse company she actually needed. Greta shrugged, which Red took as consent. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the light change across the scrubland. Finally, Red spoke in his easy drawl. "Back home on my family's ranch, we got this old mare named Patches. Meanest horse you ever met when we first got her. She'd been mistreated something awful by her previous owner, and she didn't trust anybody. Took near about 2 years before she'd let anyone touch her without trying to bite." Greta glanced at him, confused about why he was telling her about a horse. Red continued, still watching the sunset. "Thing is, Patches didn't do those mean things because she was born bad. She did them because someone taught her the world was cruel and she had to fight to survive. Once she learned different, once she figured out that not every human was going to hurt her, she turned into the gentlest animal on the whole ranch. Kids can ride her now." The implication hung in the air between them. Greta felt tears building behind her eyes. "I am not a horse," she said quietly in her careful English. "No ma'am, you're not," Red agreed. "You're a whole lot more complicated. But the principle's the same, I reckon. Sometimes people get taught wrong things about the world, about other people. Doesn't make you bad. Makes you someone who learned something false and now has to figure out what's true." Over the following weeks, these conversations became regular occurrences. Red taught Greta about Texas, about the vast empty spaces that had initially frightened her, explaining how the land that seemed barren actually teemed with life if you knew how to look for it. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived at the Texas facility, not with celebration, but with complicated silence. The American staff gathered around radios to hear the announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender, but their jubilation was muted by awareness of the German women who sat quietly in their barracks, processing what this moment meant for their future. The war that had defined their entire adult lives was over. Germany had been utterly defeated. The question now was what came next. Within days, official communications arrived from Washington regarding repatriation procedures. All German prisoners of war held in American facilities would be processed for return to occupied Germany over the coming months. The women at the Texas camp would be among the first groups transported, with departure scheduled for early June. Lieutenant Morrison gathered them in the common room to deliver the news, expecting relief or perhaps resignation. What she did not expect was the visible distress that crossed many of their faces. Greta felt her stomach clench as the lieutenant explained the repatriation timeline. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, she would be placed on a ship bound for a Germany she no longer recognized, a country that existed now only as a defeated, occupied territory divided among conquering powers. Her mother's most recent letter, which had arrived just days earlier, painted a picture of utter devastation. Munich was rubble. The farm survived but had no animals, no equipment, barely any food. Her father had returned from the Volkssturm, missing 3 fingers from frostbite, broken in body and spirit. Her sister Karin remained missing, almost certainly dead in the ruins of Berlin. What exactly was she returning to? A destroyed house with traumatized parents who could barely feed themselves? A country that would view her as a failure? A woman who had been captured by the enemy and corrupted by their kindness? Or worse, a country that would associate her with the regime that had committed such unspeakable atrocities, regardless of what she had or had not known about them? That night, unable to sleep, Greta found herself outside again, drawn to the Texas sky that had become strangely comforting in its vast indifference. Red was on night watch and saw her standing by the fence, her fingers wrapped around the chain link as if holding herself upright through force of will. "You all right, Darlin?" he asked, approaching with that same casual concern that had shocked her 3 months earlier, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. Greta turned to face him, and in that moment, something inside her broke open. "I do not want to go back," she said in English that had become much more fluent through their conversations. The words came out raw and desperate. "I know I am supposed to want to go home. I know that is where I belong. But Red, there is nothing there anymore. My home is gone. My family is broken. My country did terrible things I did not know about. And now I must carry that shame forever." Here she paused, struggling to articulate something she barely understood herself. "Here, I have found something I never had in Germany. I have found people who see me as a person, not as a symbol or a tool or a failure." Red's expression grew serious. "You saying you want to stay here? In Texas? As what?" "I do not know," Greta admitted. "I only know that going back feels like dying." Red's conversation with Greta kept him awake for the remainder of his shift. By morning, he had made a decision that would either get him reprimanded or change someone's life. He requested a meeting with Lieutenant Morrison and told her about Greta's confession, about her desperate desire to remain in America rather than return to the ruins of Germany. He expected skepticism or immediate dismissal of the idea. Instead, Lieutenant Morrison sat back in her chair with a thoughtful expression that suggested she had been anticipating something like this. "She's not the only one," the lieutenant said quietly. 3 other women have approached me, or the chaplain, expressing similar feelings. They're terrified of returning to Germany, not just because of the physical devastation, but because of what they've learned about what their country did. They feel they can't face being German anymore. Red leaned forward. "Is there any way they could stay? Legally, I mean?" Lieutenant Morrison pulled out a file she had already begun assembling, which told Red she had been researching this possibility before he ever walked into her office. "It's complicated," she explained. "Technically, they're still enemy prisoners of war, which means the Geneva Convention requires their repatriation. However," she tapped the file with one finger, "there are precedent cases for reclassifying certain prisoners as displaced persons, particularly those who can demonstrate they would face persecution or genuine hardship if returned. Given the chaos in occupied Germany and the fact that some of these women have literally no homes or families to return to, there might be grounds for special consideration." Over the following week, Lieutenant Morrison worked channels that Red didn't fully understand, communicating with officials in Washington and consulting with immigration attorneys. Meanwhile, word spread through the camp about the possibility of staying, creating a division among the women that revealed the depth of their internal struggles. Maria Schneider argued passionately that they had a duty to return to Germany to help rebuild what had been destroyed. "Running away to America is cowardice," she told the assembled women in their barracks. "Germany needs us now more than ever. Who will rebuild our country if everyone who can leave simply abandons it?" But Anna Richter countered with equal passion. "What Germany needs is to fundamentally change, not just rebuild the same structures that allowed such evil to flourish. Maybe the best thing some of us can do is show that Germans can become something different, that we can learn from our enemies and become better people." The debate raged through quiet German conversations during meals, during work details, during the long evening hours when they had nothing to do but confront their impossible choices. Liesel, the youngest, cried almost constantly, torn between longing for her homeland and terror of returning to a place where her father was dead and her future looked hopeless. June 15, 1945 arrived with the weight of finality hanging over the Texas facility. The transport trucks that would carry departing prisoners to the port in Galveston sat waiting in the yard, their engines quiet, but their presence impossible to ignore. Of the 32 German women who had arrived 3 months earlier, 23 had chosen repatriation. They stood in the morning sun with their meager belongings, faces reflecting mixtures of relief, anxiety, and determination. They were returning to uncertainty, but it was their uncertainty, in their homeland, among their own people. 9 women had made the unprecedented decision to request reclassification as displaced persons and remain in America. Lieutenant Morrison's efforts had paid off. Washington had granted provisional approval, contingent on the women finding American sponsors willing to vouch for them and provide housing and employment support. The bureaucratic language was cold and clinical, but the human reality was extraordinary. These women were choosing to stay with their former enemies rather than return to their defeated homeland. The scene in the yard resembled a family gathering more than a military prisoner transfer. The women who were leaving embraced those who were staying, tears flowing freely on both sides. They had arrived as strangers united only by nationality and military service, but the shared trauma of the past months had forged genuine bonds that transcended their different choices about the future. Maria Schneider, who had argued so passionately for return, stood before Greta with tears streaming down her weathered face. "I understand why you're staying," she said in German, "and I don't judge you for it, but I need to go back. I need to see with my own eyes what has become of our country. Maybe I can't fix it, but I have to try." Greta embraced her tightly. "You're braver than I am," she whispered. "Tell them, tell whoever is left in Germany, that not all of us forgot how to be human. Tell them that some of us learned what we should have known all along." Anna Richter, who was also staying, distributed letters she had written to each departing woman. "These are for your families, if you can find them," she explained. "Letters telling them that we were treated with kindness here, that Americans showed us mercy we didn't deserve. Maybe it will help when Germany and America have to learn to live in the same world again." Red Tucker stood at attention with the other guards as the women boarded the trucks, but Greta saw him wipe at his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Private Morrison, the lieutenant's nephew who had been assigned to the facility just weeks earlier, played a harmonica version of a German folk song as a farewell gesture, the melody drifting across the yard like a benediction. The trucks rumbled to life and pulled away, carrying 23 women toward an uncertain future in a devastated homeland. 25 years later, in the spring of 1970, Greta Hoffman Tucker stood before a packed auditorium at the Dallas Community Center, preparing to address a gathering on German-American reconciliation. At 47 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had traveled an impossible distance from who she once was. Her English now flowed without accent, though careful listeners could still detect the faint music of Bavaria in certain vowels. Beside her in the front row sat Red Tucker, her husband of 22 years, their 3 children, fidgeting with typical teenage impatience at having to attend another one of their mother's speeches. The story she told that evening had been told many times before, but it never lost its power. She spoke of arriving in Texas as an enemy prisoner, exhausted and terrified, expecting cruelty from the Americans she had been taught to hate. She described the shock of hearing a young cowboy call her Darlin while helping her with drop supplies, how that single word had shattered her expectations and begun the long process of transforming her understanding of what enemies could become. "The word that once confused and frightened me," Greta told her audience, "became the foundation of everything I built in this country. It represented something I had never experienced in Germany, a casual assumption of shared humanity that didn't require proof or earning. Red called me Darlin before he knew anything about me except that I needed help. That kind of grace changes people." Anna Richter, now Dr. Anna Richter Hayes, had traveled from Houston to attend the speech. She had completed medical school with the support of American sponsors and now ran a clinic serving immigrant communities, using her own experience as a displaced person to help others navigate the difficult transition to American life. She had married Thomas Hayes, the guard who had played harmonica those first difficult evenings at the camp, and together they had created a family that embodied the reconciliation between former enemies. The other women who had stayed had found their own paths to contribution and belonging. Liesel Wagner taught German at the University of Texas, helping a new generation understand the language and culture, while ensuring they also understood the historical warnings about what happens when nations lose their moral compass. Each woman carried the weight of their country's crimes differently, but all had chosen to honor their second chance by living lives of service and honest reckoning with the past. But Greta also spoke that evening about the women who had returned to Germany in 1945. Through letters that crossed the Atlantic for decades, she had maintained contact with Maria Schneider and others who had chosen repatriation. They had faced devastating hardships in the immediate post-war years, struggling to survive in a destroyed country under occupation. But they had also participated in Germany's remarkable transformation, helping to build a democracy from the ruins of dictatorship, ensuring that younger generations learned the full truth about their history. Maria had become a teacher in Munich, dedicating her life to civic education that confronted rather than concealed Germany's Nazi past. The legacy of those 9 women who stayed in Texas and the 23 who returned to Germany extended far beyond their individual lives. Their story had influenced American policies toward displaced persons and refugees, demonstrating that former enemies could become valued citizens when given genuine opportunities for redemption. Immigration officials cited their successful integration as evidence that nationality and past allegiances mattered less than present character and future potential. As Greta concluded her speech, she looked out at an audience that included Germans and Americans, old and young, people whose own lives had been touched by war and displacement. "Home isn't where you're born," she told them. "Home is where you choose to become who you were meant to be. Texas gave me that choice when I needed it most. A cowboy called me Darlin when I expected hatred, and in that moment, I began to understand that I could choose a different story than the one I had been living." Red squeezed her hand as she sat down to thunderous applause. Their oldest daughter leaned over and whispered, "That was actually pretty good, Mom," which from a 17-year-old represented the highest possible praise. The story of the German women prisoners who chose to stay in Texas became more than just a historical footnote. It became proof that even in the darkest times, individual humans could choose transformation over tribalism, growth over grievance, hope over hatred. They had arrived as enemies and become family, turned captivity into opportunity, and showed that the truest victory over war was the conversion of former foes into friends, of strangers into neighbors, of prisoners into citizens who honored their second chance by building lives worthy of the grace they had been shown.